Okay, it seems like people are starting to join, so we'll start, but we'll start slowly to allow hopefully others who are participating in the previous events with our fish and the European Commissioner on Climate and Fisheries can finish up that and join us here. And hopefully some of what we talk about now will complement what was discussed previously, and we can build on what was said there. So we're here to launch the new report from Pew, looking back at implementation of the Common Fisheries Policy, which, even though I always urge us to avoid acronyms, for that one I think we're now going to allow, and I will refer to as the CFP. But the report looks at the implementation over the past 7 years and summarises some of the lessons that have been learnt. Andrew Clayton from Pew, who I'll introduce shortly, will be presenting the report and distilling some of the lessons that are outlined there. And we'll then open to observations from Monica from Seas at Risk, who joins us on the panel, and then hopefully over to you for questions. Hopefully you've all seen a copy of the report. There is a link to it on the email that you have been sent, and we'll certainly be sending it out with other materials after this webinar. Just to quickly introduce myself as others join, Martin Clark. I was pleased many years ago, I think back in 2007, I helped facilitate the workshop that led to the establishment of the Ocean 2012 Coalition, which went to work on the last CFP reform. So I am delighted to be invited back to help moderate this session as we look back at the lessons learnt in the implementation of the CFP. Just to run through some housekeeping tips and how we're going to run the meeting. The meeting is being recorded, and so we can make a copy of the recording available afterwards. Closed captioning for those who want it is available. I think on the right of your screen, if you see a little pull down for multimedia view, if you click on that and then press continue, and that should give you access to closed captioning for those who need it. How we're going to run the session today is after introducing the panel again, will hand over to Andrew, who will run through a quick presentation for about 15 minutes, bringing out the key lessons from the report, looking back at implementation of the CFP. And then following further comments and reactions from Monica as our other panelists, we want to hand it over to you all for questions. I should say that we're running this so that only the panelists will be seen and heard, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. But how we invite you to contribute is to submit your questions in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. We're not going to be using the chat function, but if you open up the Q&A box, opportunity to send through questions, please do direct them to all panel members. That just means we can all see them, and then I will pass them on to members of the panel to respond to. And I think for formalities, that's it, but I'll remind us of the process for asking questions when we've heard from Andrew and Monica. But do start sending in your questions as soon as you like, particularly those who've read the report. If you've got burning questions already, do put them in the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll have time to get to them in the discussion areas. So let me then introduce the panel. Andrew Clayton, who is the project director for Pew's work to end overfishing in Europe. He's going to present the report and talk through the lessons learned. And then Monica Verbeek, who is executive director from Seas at Risk, an umbrella organisation of environmental NGOs from across Europe that promotes ambitious policies for marine protection in Europe and internationally. And Monica at Seas and Risk were also closely involved in EU fisheries policy, including in the reform back in 2013. So with that said, let me hand over to Andrew to run through the key lessons from the report. Then we'll hear from Monica, and then hopefully over to you and your questions. Thank you. Andrew.
Okay, thank you, Martin. That was a good introduction to the report and the content. So before I go into the detail, I'll just say that this is the story of more than 7 years of working on the policy and its implementation. I think now is a good time to look back because several of the policy's deadlines have passed in the last few years. And hopefully this report is instructive, not just for future fisheries management, but more widely, because there are several ambitious pledges being made on environmental policies. And hopefully this report is useful to show what actually happens in the implementation. So I'll start with a bit of history that we have on the screen here. The reform of the CFP over a decade ago began with a green paper from the Commission that was quite brutally honest in its description of the CFP's failings at the time. Decades of overfishing, the waste of discarding of fish, an overly centralized policy, short-termism. And that kicked off this process that took a few years to agree a new common fisheries policy in 2013. It came into effect the following year, and the implementation began. Now, the CFP brought with it some deadlines to end overfishing. A soft deadline in 2015 and a harder deadline in 2020. There was also the landing obligation that was to be gradually rolled out by 2019. And then many other important policy aims and details in the CFP to bring about a long-term perspective and to regionalize the policy, things like that. So this was a big reform, and there's a democratic process at the heart of that as well, because those pledges became law because there was a demand from the public. The CFP was agreed by 28 member state governments, by 751 members of the European Parliament. And that mandate from the public and from all those lawmakers didn't stop just with the legislation. Implementation takes some stamina, and that's why we wanted to analyze the process of implementation. So you have on the screen already the first of our lessons here. I'm going to take you through 8 lessons that are covered in the report. And the first of those is that good management works. So sustainable exploitation rates help stocks to recover. The stocks are responsive to management, and we get the outcomes that we're aiming for. This is a win-win, not just for the environment, but it leads to productive fisheries and contributes to the industry's profit. So there's nothing earth-shattering in this. This is what what other fisheries managers around the world have experienced, and it's good news that good management works. It's notable, though, I think, that in the EU, the job is not yet complete in terms of ending overfishing. There are many estimates of the sizable minority of stocks that are still overfished. The latest official data shows it's something around 38% of stocks are still fished, higher than the level required in the CFP. And that's even though the lines in the graph are going in the right direction. So the level of overfishing is reducing, the number of stocks being overfished is reducing, and we're headed in the right direction, but not fast enough to meet the deadlines that we included in the CFP and law. So alongside those positives and the progress being made, we wanted to analyze implementation against the specifics in the policy, specifically what the law required, so that we can analyze those shortfalls and try to look at the reasons for them so we can learn. So the next lesson touches on one of those reasons. This is the decreased ambition since 2013 led to under-implementation. So those shortfalls in progress, they weren't just an accident or bad luck. They were conscious choices in many cases. So within months of the CFP coming into force, legislators were developing laws to allow fishing to continue at rates higher than the benchmarks in the CFP, or they were adjusting stock recovery targets to aim lower than the CFP required. For example, just avoiding stock collapse instead of restoring stocks to the productive levels that were foreseen. In some cases, the requirements were simply discarded if they were too difficult. So some of the implementing laws omitted a whole range of ecosystem protections that were foreseen for the regional process. They just weren't applied or implemented. In some cases, the EU removed catch limits for some stocks, such as darb and flounder, and vulnerable deep sea stocks like greater forkbeard. The quotas that had limited catches of those stocks were just removed, which I think was quite a signal to send in terms of the ambition to implement this policy. On the face of it, all of those individual decisions were practical compromises to smooth the management in practice, all kind of following the logic of the fisheries management process. But what they added up to was, in effect, redefining and reducing the EU's ambition under the CFP. So it wasn't about setting ambitious goals and just not quite meeting these targets. These were clear-eyed decisions to aim lower, written carefully and deliberately into the EU legislation after the CFP had been reformed. So I'll move on to a related point, and this is that decisions often favoured maintaining the status quo. It's a similar point about reduced ambition, but I think it speaks to the way that fisheries management is shaped. When these ambitions for a paradigm shift met with existing practices, the rules were molded around the existing practices. So things like the overfishing of heavily depleted stocks that were caught as bycatch, every effort was made to maintain the highest possible catches of the target stock in those fisheries, even if this meant introducing new concepts like bycatch quotas to allow that weaker stock to be legally overfished. Things like the landing obligation. I mean, the landing obligation, the discard ban, was such a huge change in EU fisheries policy. It was intended to transform behaviour in many areas. But what sucked up a lot of time and energy was tailoring its rules and tailoring the exemptions and the quota requirements to match existing patterns of fishing activity and to match existing patterns of quota allocation, because governments proved very reluctant to change anything about quota allocation. The rollout of the landing obligation was backloaded as well, so it was kind of deferred for a few years to allow discarding to continue, and then all brought in at once in 2019 in one big ban phase. And we're yet to see exactly how that's shaking down, what impact that has had on management. One of the emerging risks, I'm not sure it's fully understood yet, is that the catch limits set throughout this period of rolling out the landing obligation, catch limits were inflated on the assumption that the landing obligation was fully and perfectly implemented. So there's no buffer, no slack to account for any continued discarding going on over the horizon. And that's a risky assumption that could come back to bite us in future, because it could disrupt stock assessments. It could mean the limits that we're setting now are already too high because there's discarding going on top of that, out of sight. And this isn't just a kind of theoretical concern that there might be some illegal discarding going on. The European Fisheries Control Agency highlights concerns that discarding is continuing and that we don't have a full grip on that fishing mortality. So it's an unnecessary risk that managers are still taking, which, as I say, could come back to haunt us. So I'll move on to the fourth lesson, and this is that EU decision-making remains siloed. The EU is setting its ambitions really high on protections for the natural environment, on biodiversity, on sustainable industries, but too often fisheries policy is allowed to remain completely separate from those aims and those policies, and even to work against them. And it's not about the policies necessarily not being joined up on paper. It's a structural point. The EU institutions and member state governments as well, they're committed to things like good environmental status under other pieces of legislation, but it's often different officials, different ministers in the room deciding on fisheries policy, and often deciding on management measures that damage ecosystems and make it harder to achieve those other environmental aims. Now, the CFP has those requirements in it. They weren't left out. They're there in black and white. There needs to be coherence between fisheries policy and these other environmental aims. There's a requirement for an ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management. But there's little reporting on how those elements of the CFP are actually being delivered, which suggests they're probably not a priority. So I think mainstreaming fisheries policy is really necessary, so that there's accountability, and we probably need scrutiny of those fisheries decisions by other institutions, like the Environment Committee in the European Parliament, for example, should have a say. There should be some clarity on how those fisheries decisions are leading to these achievements of the other aims. Moving on, this next lesson is about short-term thinking. So short-termism is a classic problem in fisheries management, particularly in the setting of catch limits. This one's perhaps not helped by the exclusive competence of ministers in the council for setting catch limits. They have a track record of short-term risk-taking and having a one-year horizon for their decisions. The long-term objectives of the CFP were really clear, as were the deadlines on overfishing, but it wasn't always easy to detect much strategic intent in some of those annual decisions by ministers, as the 2015 deadline and the 2020 deadline came and went. And in the report, if you have a look at the report, it has concrete examples of cod stocks being overfished as they were starting to collapse on the basis that a compromise was needed in the short term, only to face a much more dire situation the following year, even the closure of those fisheries. So we've got to start basing these decisions on longer term aims. The next lesson is about reporting and lack of clarity on reporting on progress. If you can't measure something, it's hard to manage it. We, of course, have very clear objectives in the CFP, so it's strange to me that we don't have a clear dashboard against those requirements. On stock recovery, there's very little information provided on the achievement of those aims as written in the CFP. On exploitation rates, over the years, we've used a few different metrics, or the Commission has reported in a few different ways. Switching between these has been confusing, and excluding some stocks from some metrics is counterproductive. So the Commission has increasingly used a subset of stocks and focused on the large volumes of catches that those stocks provide, and on which they've made really good progress. It's a good news story. But as positive as those figures are, that's not the requirement in the CFP. It risks sending a message that we're only interested in those most lucrative, most productive stocks at the expense of other stocks that are often depleted and just as important to the ecosystem, and they're subject to the CFP rules, the same rules. So into that vacuum have stepped organizations like mine and other scientists have produced reports trying to get to the bottom of where we might stand on some of these metrics. And I'm very proud of the analysis that we've done. And if you go to our website, there's a lot of detail there and past reports about how we've tried to track these aims over the years. But really reconstructing that jigsaw of information with a lot of detective work and a lot of hard digging, it's no substitute for official data and just having the clear official picture on how we're doing against those CFP objectives. And the report even gives an example of a December Council 18 months ago, where different stakeholders reacted differently to the decisions on catch limits, disagreeing on the basic facts. Now, I think it's quite normal that stakeholders would react differently to the decisions and have different viewpoints, but it's not helpful for the policy if those stakeholders have different facts as a starting point. And I think that's something that should be addressed. Moving on to the penultimate lesson now, this is about transparency and opaque decision-making hampering progress. So fisheries decision-making is complex and technical, but it doesn't mean it needs to be done in secret. And the report highlights some transparency issues across all institutions, but really here it's the council where I think the most improvement is needed. The report includes some detail on the European Ombudsman's recent findings on the council's fisheries process, and those findings are really damning. I would urge you to go and look at the wording there and what they've said about how the council operates. For those not familiar with the council process, it's almost part of the annual theatre now that ministers decide catch limits in the middle of the night, behind closed doors, with no explanation of the numbers that they've arrived at. And this normally follows publication of the scientific advice, normally several months earlier. So any member of the public can go to the ICES website, they can see the official scientific advice, detailed advice for each stock, they can look at that throughout the year, but we can't see what happens just during those few hours on the second night of the council when those numbers tend to creep up dramatically in the middle of the night. Now, Several of the reforms were intended to change this, to give a long-term perspective and try to link those decisions to the science more closely. But there's not much sign of that council decision-making circus ending, and much of that corridor diplomacy and frantic late-night negotiation, that's kind of been transplanted onto the international negotiations and the post-Brexit talks with the UK, for example. So this is still a cause for concern. Now, we've seen some incremental improvements in this area. These seem to be down to the commitment of the Commission and the Commissioner to hold ministers responsible. We saw some improvement on last year's process, for example, to improve the transparency of that. My concern is that we need to see structural improvements so that we get this information into the public domain. It shouldn't be reliant on the dedication of officials working in DG Mare, as grateful as we are for that, but I think it needs to be put on a formal footing. Okay, now the final lesson. So I alluded to it. This is about stocks shared with non-EU countries, presenting particular challenges. So it's worth recognising the progress the EU has made when it has the sole responsibility for the management of stocks. Some evidence that where the stocks are shared with others, it's harder to hold every party to sustainable management. The Northeast Atlantic pelagic stocks are a prime example of this, where all of the different parties in the Northeast Atlantic catching those fish agree in principle that they want to follow the scientific advice. They agree on what the scientific advice is, but they can't agree on their relative shares of those catches. So generally each year they take a bite out of those stocks that's equivalent to 130% of the advice. And that overfishing continues. And of course, now we have the bilaterals with the UK and the trilaterals between the UK, EU and Norway. That adds another dimension. So some greater transparency there would be helpful. We have multiple parties there managing their joint fisheries. All those parties are promising sustainable fisheries. In the UK's case, they're promising world-leading fisheries, the greenest fisheries management on the planet. There shouldn't be any difficulty in agreeing sustainable measures between these parties, yet there often is. So only last week, the parties agreed to exceed scientific advice for North Sea cod in this year's limit, despite the EU seemingly trying to persuade the others, like the UK, to stick to the advice. So we're starting to see these concrete examples, perhaps of the UK aiming lower. We want the UK to do better, but the EU is going to have to show some leadership here to achieve its own goals in this context. So that's a very quick run through of the lessons in the report. I just wanted to finish with a kind of a look ahead to the future. So implementation continues. Of course, the EU and UK are still negotiating their measures for 2021. There's still work ahead on that, just even for this year's management. But there's also still time to implement the CFP before the Commission is required to report on progress next year. There are also challenges ahead. I know many of the audience in this webinar will have been in the event with the Commissioner talking about the climate and fisheries. We're not going to be able to treat stocks and fisheries in isolation. There are going to be shocks to the system. We're increasingly feeling the impact of climate on European fisheries. Perhaps like the COVID pandemic, we have shocks to come that are not fully grasped. So we're going to need resilience for those stocks. We're going to need resilience for the industry to weather these storms. And I think moving on from the short-termism is a good way to get out of that boom and bust cycle that we've seen in the past. So it's very clear that if we're going to achieve the EU's aims that it has for addressing habitat degradation, biodiversity loss, supporting sustainable industries, there still needs to be change in fisheries. And I think the CFP that we have is actually a good place to start. Implementing the CFP's provisions, these provisions are already nicely aligned to these future needs, to these threats. We want to push forward on things like ecosystem-based management because there are some answers there for how we can prepare for these challenges ahead. And I would just finish by saying that the Commission's implementation report that I mentioned there, the Commissioner are required to report on implementation by the end of 2022, so that's creeping up on us. I really hope this report is helpful to the Commission. I hope we can start that debate on how the CFP has been implemented and point to how things can be improved. So I hope it's useful. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And please do keep the questions going in the Q&A box on the right. But before going to your questions, I'd like to turn over to Monica from Seas at Risk for your perhaps reactions to the report, but also your reflections on CFP implementation over the past years.
Well, I wouldn't dare to add any more lessons. I think the report is very, very thorough and actually clarifies very concisely what has happened and where the things went wrong and what could have been done better and where implementation failed. And so rather than trying to add more to this or go deeper than Andrew, which is, you know, not possible, I think I'll just step back a bit. I'm better at that. And just remind everybody basically what Andrew already said, but we cannot afford to look at fisheries in isolation, because fish are not only food, they're not only a commodity of the fishing industry, they are part of a marine ecosystem, and they do play a key role in the food web and contribute to balanced ecosystems and a resilient ocean. So healthy fish stocks contribute to a healthy marine environment, and so to the ocean's capacity to cope with climate change. And as we have learned now this week in this Our Fish webinar series, they also contribute to climate mitigation because they're part of the carbon cycle. And so fish do play an important role also in ocean carbon sequestration. And the importance of a healthy ocean is now highlighted in the European Green Deal and in the biodiversity strategy. So this is the direction where the EU wants to go, and EU fisheries policy must contribute to the delivery of these commitments, clearly. So that means first and foremost, indeed, as Andrew already mentioned, you know, they need to take the objectives of the CFP to safeguard ecosystems and to achieve good environmental status. They need to take it serious. So really, in order to get a bit more seriousness to this, they need to define implementing steps with a timeline and require official reporting on the achievements of these objectives. They must understand better the combined effects of pressures like overfishing and climate change on marine food webs, and incorporate that in fisheries management decision making. Because currently the fishing industry is the only maritime industry that's not required to produce environmental impact assessments of its activities. Not of the impacts on the marine environment and let alone impacts on the climate. So fisheries management, it must embrace the new reality that the world is changing fast, and maintaining stocks at higher levels and reducing the impact of fishing on ocean habitats are now mandatory requirements for a climate resiliency. Now, so we really see now this disconnect between fisheries decisions and the ambitions of the Green Deal. EU fisheries managers obviously fail to look beyond short-term commercial value and fish as a commodity. So to ensure a more coherent approach, fisheries and environment policymakers must work closer together. DG Environment, Parliament's Environment Committee, they must get a greater say in fisheries policy. So fisheries management proposals must also explain how they will help deliver on the wider commitments and explain what will be done to reconcile policies that run counter environmental policies. So fisheries decisions clearly cannot just left alone with the fisheries managers. They have shown they are not capable of it, so their decisions need to be taken with much more transparency and be scrutinized by environmental and climate authorities. I think we have to step out of the fishing ghetto, get a bit further away, bring in all the other stakeholders that have just as much importance with the fish as the fisheries, like the climate authorities, environmental authorities, and they need to get a say about it as well, because as long as it stays with just fisheries ministers, and the fisheries ministers do have the impression that they only need to treat fish as a commodity and that they only have to respond to the fishing industry needs, it will be very hard to get to a real good implementation of the CFP and to obtain the objectives of the CFP.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you, Monica. For anyone who perhaps was in the previous event and joined us a little bit late and didn't see all of Andrew's presentation, hopefully you will have got a copy of the report, so you can see the summary of the lessons there. Please do all keep the questions coming, and just to repeat, we're using the Q&A function, which you should have on the right hand side of your screen, and please do, when you're typing in your question, pick the option that sends it to all panel members. If you don't do that, the chances are we're going to miss it, and then I'll be passing on your questions to the panelists. And the first one, I think very much, I mean, it came in before you started speaking, Monica, and I think in part you've answered it, but you may want to add. But let me put this one to Andrew perhaps first. And so the immediate nature of sort of watering down of the ambitions after such a visible and publicly supported policy reform is very striking. And what does that say about current ambitious goals being set in policy and law, and how can we prevent that they get immediately watered down once the spotlight fades? Will you react to that, Andrew, and then I'll see if you want to add, Monica?
Yeah, that's a big question, really. I think there are some specific things about fisheries policy because of the technical nature of it. It's very easy for the spotlight to move on after such a high-profile reform as we had in 2013. But I think the one lesson you can draw from that is that you do need to button things down. You need to have quite clear objectives in your policies and in the law. One of the problems with previous iterations of the CFP is that we've had objectives to have sustainable fishing. Nobody wants overfishing. There's no fisheries minister who turns up at a council asking for unsustainable fishing, and there's no industry person who wants that. But these broad intentions aren't enough. And where we've had success in European fisheries policy is when we've set those long-term objectives. We've had long-term management plans with harvest strategies in them. So I mean, this is going into more detail, but we should have automatic harvest rules for these stocks where we say, okay, here's our strategy for this fishery, and when we get a signal from the science that says X, we do Y. And that takes out a lot of the politics. It takes out a lot of the kind of responding in real time to bad news. We can plan ahead, and we know what our pre-configured reaction will be when something happens. And that's the kind of thing I think has to be written into the policy. Leaving it to goodwill and hoping for the best further down the line isn't great. And I don't know what the average tenure is for a fisheries minister, but I remember they used to say it was only kind of 2 or 3 years. We need to make sure that our decisions are building these stocks for the long term and providing fisheries and employment and food, into the long term. And the only way to do that is to be quite precise in the law, and that's what other countries have done as well. I mean, these are the lessons that have been learned around the world. This isn't a unique thing to Europe. The biology of European stocks isn't that different to elsewhere.
Thanks, Andrew. Monica, would you have anything to add to that?
No, it's basically what Andrew said and what I said before. Make sure that the people who have to implement the policy, that their objectives are aligned and going in the right direction, and if not so, make sure there's others there looking over their shoulders and making sure they are doing the job, and indeed make sure that the law is so clear in what needs to be done, cut down in steps and with reporting obligations, etc., that it's harder to wriggle out of it. That said, if there's really no political will, I guess everybody can wriggle out of it. So I guess the other thing is ensure that the political will is there by clearly showing that it is going against interests of not only the fishers, not only of the communities, not only of but also of the sea, of the future of this planet, and hopefully instill that a bit on them. Still, yeah, it's a hard job, but that's why we are here, no? The NGOs.
Thank you. You mentioned political will, but a couple of questions are also touching on the legal obligation. And isn't the CFP EU law to which the Commission and others have to obey? And someone else has asked if ministers can be legally held accountable for, breaking European law. Monica, do you maybe want to take that first, and then I'll hand to Andrew?
Okay, well, I'll be completely honest. When 2020 deadline came and ministers were still, pushing for overfishing, I thought, clear. Now let's go to court. Now they'll hear from us. And then only to find out that that was totally naive, and that actually the system is not really in favor for holding joint ministers, councils accountable for their decisions. It's actually incredibly hard. So, you start wondering if the EU justice system is actually fit for purpose, but that's a very big question. But at least within countries, you can certainly hold ministers accountable, and preferably still during their term as a minister to get some public pressure on them as well.
Thank you. Andrew, would you add to that?
I would just add that I think, accountability goes broader than just the recourse to legal action. The decision making under the CFP is still democratic. It is ministers who are elected and representative of their citizens when they make these decisions in the council. The Parliament is obviously directly elected, and there's a clear process. There isn't a mystery as to how these decisions were watered, how ambition was watered down. It was done in plain sight, and it was done through individual decisions that had their own logic at the time. I think there is a tendency, particularly among member state ministries, to nationalize the wins and Europeanize the failures. So they tend to go home and tell their national audience that anything unpopular was done behind the closed doors in Brussels, and then anything they've won was a massive victory for them. So I think one of the challenges all along has been to try to hold ministers accountable for their decisions on catch limits, because it's a council decision generally done unanimously. It's very rare that we get any hint of one member state objecting. And that makes it hard. You can see the work of the New Economics Foundation, for example, who did their Landing the Blame series, where they tried to identify which countries had the biggest shares of which stocks were being overfished. And that was really interesting data to drill down to that level and try to find patterns. But it's very hard to make that stick on individual governments. And all I would kind of, I think that accountability has to be with the individuals who hold the decision-making power, and we've got to keep holding those ministers to account in their national parliaments, hold them to account for the things that they're saying about their ambitions for the environment, that fisheries is part of that.
Thank you. You mentioned the accountability of individuals, and there's a question looking at the role of individuals as activists, perhaps, and how can those of us working to educate the public, on smaller platforms, best convey the importance of the individual. It's easy for individuals to think that these issues are above their heads. So what advice would you give to those who are interested, perhaps not without or currently without the big platforms? How can they get engaged, and how can they support? I don't know who wants to take that first. Or I'll pick on Monica.
Well, thank you. And then I'll find out that Andrew has a much cleverer answer to this. But it's a difficult one. I mean, what was very clear during the CFP reform, that by calling on the public for support, by reaching out to them, and then coming together, there was really a big pressure, a public movement to get an end to overfishing, to get better fisheries management. So I think pointing back to moments like that, where, I mean, when the public was outraged with the fact that fish were chucked overboard, that is when all of a sudden they start to talk about discarding being a problem. Before that, it was not a problem. Well, the fishers thought it was a problem, but then it became something politicians picked up on. So even if it's just an individual, 10 individuals, 1,000 individuals, you really can build a lot of pressure and bring things to the table that weren't there. Politicians respond to public scrutiny. And actually, about the lending obligation, something that I wanted to mention already before. There's now a lot of criticism. Lending obligation doesn't work. It only leads to overfishing because fishers get extra quota because they're supposed not to discard, but they discard anyway. It's not working. And the fishers say, well, we told you so, it wouldn't be working. It doesn't make any sense. But they have a very short-term memory, because just before the whole idea of lending obligation came, on the table of politicians, on the negotiation table, it was actually the fishers who complained that they had to discard fish because of all the stupid rules from Brussels, and Brussels didn't know what they were talking about, and they're giving them so many different rules. It's impossible to keep and continue fishing, and so they were forced to do this awfully wasteful practice. And so the Commission turned around and said, well, actually, yeah, you're right. We will not tell you anymore what to do exactly, which mesh size, where, etc. We understand it can be a bit impractical. We just want you to take the measures you think are best to make sure you are only catching the fish you can catch, that you don't have the bycatch that you want to discard. And so we ask you to come up with ideas. We will just check that you're not discarding. You have to bring everything to land, and you know best, because you're the fisher in the sea. You know best where to fish and not to fish to get the best catch. So they were basically totally listening to all the demands of the fishers, coming up with this proposal for the landing obligation. And now the fishers not trying to do anything to reduce their bycatch, just saying it doesn't work. So just to say that sometimes it helps to have a bit of a historic view on it.
Thanks, Monica. Andrew, anything from your perspective about how individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take this in one particular direction. I just want to mention the role of consumers, because I know this is actually a live debate for anybody looking at Twitter at the moment. There's a reason we analysed the decisions made by managers in this report and the decisions made by governments and the EU institutions. It's because they're responsible for fisheries management. It's because they're accountable for fisheries management. And I think there is a great deal that individuals can do in getting involved with organisations and making their own consumption choices. But we've got to focus where the changes are needed, and governments are responsible for this. I think having governments set catch limits, manage the whole system, allocate quota, have fishers out there catching the fish and marketing it, often with government subsidies and public money going into that process. And to do all of that and then get to the very end of the process and say that sustainability is something that consumers have to fix, I don't think that's the right way of going about it. So I do think this is about governance, and it's about holding governments to account for good management and not asking consumers to pick up the mess at the end.
Thank you, Andrew. It's not for me to answer questions, but I'm a believer in ecosystem-based advocacy as well as management, where there is an ecosystem of the large NGOs, of scientists, of individual activists and voters and fishers themselves, who all have a part to play. But I think that maybe also takes us on.
Can I add one thing as well? Just to, I mean, living where I happen to live, I've been told many times in recent years that fish are our common public resource. They're the birthright of all citizens and future generations of fishermen and women. And that can only go so far without giving the public a say in how fisheries are managed. So this isn't a specialist niche topic. We all have a say in this for all the reasons that Monica laid out quite clearly.
Great, thank you. And that actually segues, I think, into the next question we've got, which points out that the involvement of stakeholders is one of the important objectives of the reform in 2013 to promote greater inclusion and transparency in decision making. and what lessons you have to share on the role. I mean, this question goes specifically to the role of the advisory councils since their creation, the challenges, shortcomings. Andrew?
Maybe I could take that. Yeah, I mean, we've been a member of 3 or 4 advisory councils over the last 7 years. I've personally been a member of a couple of them, taking part in that work, and it was really fruitful and fascinating work to be involved in. I think advisory councils are the right way forward. They bring together industry stakeholders with other stakeholders like the NGOs and anglers and others. And yeah, I mean, they're there to advise. That's in their name. They're there to give information to decision makers on how to overcome some of these tricky practical things. And they're very important. So we're still committed to them. I think what we have found across the work of all the NGOs in Europe, across advisory councils, is that there are improvements needed there as well. We touch on it in the report. I think the process could be sharpened. I think transparency could be improved. Certain things are needed, like really kind of focused impartial chairing and clear recording of positions. All these kind of procedural things, and I hope the advisory councils will continue to improve in that way.
Right, thank you. I don't know whether you've got anything to add on that, Monica, or we'll pick up another question.
I just wanted to add that advisory councils are very important. Obviously, they haven't been functioning splendidly in the past years, and that has made some NGOs and their engagement simply because the costs were too big for the benefits. But in principle, the idea is very good when implemented well. And besides the fact that it helps you provide input at in a transparent way and early on in the processes of policy, it has the additional benefit that you're stuck in a room with fishers for quite a while, and that therefore invariably you start to understand each other a little bit better. And that certainly helps with also trying to find compromises or for once seeing their side and understanding where they're coming from in order to perhaps afterwards be better able to explain why you disagree. But it certainly helps to make some linkages and to get some more common ground for fisheries management.
Thanks, Monica. Back to you maybe first, Andrew. One of the drivers for the 2013 reform was a desire for simplification. And 7 years on, it seems we're stuck with multiple regulations, multi-annual plans, etc., which add very little regional specificity, but do significantly and with small variations change the rules in each of the regions, with the biggest changes in the Mediterranean, where even the 2020 deadline was postponed. What happens to all the industry and member state appetite for simple, clear rules that put in place a level playing field for everybody?
Right. Well, I think there's 2 things I would say there. First of all, in principle, if you need a load of exemptions and loopholes, you're going to have complicated legislation. So you're not going to simplify anything by giving 1 million opt-outs to that. And I mean, if you look at the evolution of discard plans under the new CFP, that tells that story. They were foreseen as kind of short-term instruments to allow that requirement to be eased in. Now we have a proliferating set of discard plans that have become permanent technical measures. So, that's become complicated. It addresses a need because there was a demand for these specificities. So fair enough. Fisheries management is complicated, but that will cause complication. Multi-annual plans in particular, though, I think the person asking the question makes a good point that multi-annual plans were a way to deliver regionalization. There was supposed to be a different plan for each region that would be tailored to the specificities of that region. So you could put in all the specifics that are needed in that area to reflect the nature of that ecosystem, to reflect the nature of the fisheries in that area. That was the intent. I don't think that has been what has been delivered in practice, and the report goes into some detail on this. explains that basically maps were, I think, by many of the people involved, they were seen as the way to deliver the loopholes, the way to deliver the reduced ambition, and they were very successfully used to do that. But while we were opposing that, and that wasn't seen as good news, I think it took us some time to realize that also what was happening is they were becoming precedents to then apply all the same loopholes everywhere else. So what we actually had with the first map, the first multi-annual plan for the Baltic, and then subsequent ones for the North Sea and the Med, they were just setting the ground rules to water things down a little bit, and then they could just be applied in a blanket way elsewhere. We had none of those specificities, none of those kind of ecosystem addressing things that we expected in those plans. It became a real cut and paste, a one size fits all thing, which was the opposite of what was intended. So there's a real lesson there. I mean, I don't know how we would get out of that situation, but we could start by making them regional again and revisiting them and saying, you know, what is actually needed in those regions. The delay of the deadline in the Med, I mean, if there's the clearest example of a subordinate piece of legislation amending not just something in the main CFP, but one of the biggest political drivers, one of the biggest conclusions of that reform process that was celebrated by members of the Parliament, by ministers, by the Commission at the time. So yeah, I never would have believed we would have ended up there.
Thank you. Anything to add, Monica?
No, indeed, the multi-annual plans were the thing that would make everything concise and nicely, the nice overview, and instead you just have every little bit of legislation with lots of loopholes. So yeah, no, nothing really to add. It's really a shame we never managed to get even one multi-annual plan even remotely close to what it was set out to be.
Thank you. Andrew, you highlighted unclear and inconsistent reporting a number of times in your report. Why do you think managers are trying to move the goalposts? You know, have you raised this with the authorities, and what response do you get?
I mean, I think if you look at our contributions to the Commission has a consultation every summer on the plans for the following year's fishing opportunities, and we've constantly flagged these issues. I should inject some positivity. To be fair to the Commission here, you know, measuring against the biomass MSY target, I don't want to go into acronyms for the audience here, but the maximum sustainable yield objective, as it regards biomass, it's really hard to measure that. It's been hard for them to get hold of the data. I think we're seeing signs through the Commission's Science Committee that they are trying to get hold of that data and try to do an honest assessment of that. So, you know, we're seeing some progress, and hopefully that will bear fruit. But yeah, I mean, it's something that is missing and needs to be addressed. I think the fact that the more positive figures have been at the forefront of the headlines, I can understand why that is. We all want to see positivity and we'd rather see good news, but I think that does muddy the waters. I think using the tonnage figures that they've used to show a very high percentage of landings are in theory sustainable. You know, if there's good news like that, let's celebrate that good news, but I don't want it to overshadow the clear reporting that we should be getting, and that's the point we make in the report. So I hope it's going to be improved. I know there are data issues, and the Commission is no doubt trying their best. So let's look out for that this year.
Okay, thank you. And do you think Brexit's going to mean that there will be even less transparency around decision making, considering that most decisions are going to be made in closed council meetings or in international negotiations where the EU has even less control over the proceedings?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I think it potentially leads to less transparency. We've got a different process, less clear procedures. One of the big concerns was that we wouldn't be able to attend some of these talks. And one of our big bugbears in the past with the EU-Norway process is that the industry representatives are allowed to attend, they're allowed to be in the room, and we were prevented from attending, and we've never been able to attend those. Now that is changing. We're starting to get into some of the bilateral and trilateral talks. So there's signs of optimism there, but certainly, I mean, the way the negotiations need to happen now, whether they're not even happening behind the closed doors of the council building, they're happening between the EU and the UK, or EU, UK, Norway, in a room that we can't access. And yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, it's difficult to get hold of information on mandates because every side is very guarded. Perhaps this will develop as they grow to trust each other, but very difficult to even know what is the position of the EU or the UK going into those talks. How do we find out whether they're even asking for sustainable catch limits, for example? And I should be very clear that we have serious concerns about the UK position on some of these things. So we're reassured by the position the EU has taken, not by the UK, because they've gone into the talks on the big post-Brexit agreement, for example, saying they would like to consider the scientific advice, but temper that against socio-economic short-term interests. That's a red flag. It's not good. So yeah, concerns.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm conscious, and I see questions still coming, but I'm going to try and be good and hopefully close on time. So apologies to anybody whose question we didn't get to. But I would like to turn first to Monica and then Andrew for any last reflections, and then we'll wrap up this webinar. Monica.
Mute.
Monica, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, that's probably best, but okay, I'll let the sound come through. Final reflections. Well, I think it's clear that we need to future-proof fisheries management, right? So with, again, going back to the changes we see in the ocean, implementing an ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management really needs to happen. Incorporating the combined effects of climate change and fisheries into fisheries management decision-making, supported by impact assessments of fisheries on the environment and the climate. So embedding the whole thing in the Green Deal, ensuring policy coherence, getting wider scrutiny of fisheries decisions by environmental and climate authorities, gradual just transition to low-impact fisheries, phasing out non-selective, fuel-intensive and destructive fisheries. But it's all a bit further down the line, I guess. Very first step is really get the intention of the current CFP embraced and the policy fully implemented. And I think with the lessons that Andrew explained at the start, I think we have a good basis to start from to get this done.
Thank you, Monica. Andrew.
Yeah, Monica puts it very well there. I think it is about future-proofing and being ready for the shocks that might be on the horizon. And for me, the tools are there in the CFP. I think that's one of the clear lessons that we draw from looking back over implementation, that we still have a chance to implement these tools. We still have time, even though some of those deadlines have passed. We have time before the Commission has to assess the policy next year. We have time before we have to start thinking about what changes we might want in future. And I think not treating fisheries in isolation and just treating it as a yield game, just looking for the tonnage that we can get every year, I think is where we've gone wrong in the past. And I think there's loads of positive signs. I mean, the report has positivity in it. We've tried to reflect where the trends are going in the right direction, where we've tried to reflect where it gives a lot of hope that doing the right thing is leading to good outcomes. So Things are moving much slower than I would like, and I hope these lessons will be instructive in helping to speed things up.
Thank you, and that's probably a very good note to close on. We're just over the hour, so we will bring this to a close, and I think it just remains with me to thank Monica and Andrew very much for your contributions and your presentation. Particularly thank to everybody who joined for some excellent questions that came through, and I'm sorry if we didn't have a chance to get to all of them, but hopefully we captured at least a flavour of the questions that were coming through. We will, I think, be circulating a recording of this webinar, and then there's the report and the report hopefully you've already got, and the presentation. And let's keep the conversation going. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.